For too long, men have been told to get out of the abortion conversation, to get out of the home, and to get out of marriage in any sort of consequential way. Today, I sit down with Sean Corcoran, head of Men for Life, an organization that refutes all of those claims, brings men back into the conversation, and helps them find their identity and who they are in Christ. Sean counsels men. He speaks all around the country about his own experience losing his first child to abortion at the age of 19, his journey back into school, into recovery, actually to get his own law degree, and a near miss at starting his own organization to help fathers, the redirection from God into this organization where he helps families and men step into their identities. Join us because we get into the roles of femininity and masculinity. We talk about the roles of fathers and how consequential policy can be when men are trying to have a leg to stand on, and some of the negative implications of introducing men into policy fights. And really, what's our bottom line? Who are we trying to protect? And whose life are we trying to save? And how do we go about that? Stick around. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Sean, thank you so much for meeting with me today. I am thrilled that you're here to have this very important conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to do this.
Tell us about Men for Life, but starting with your story.
That would go back to my freshman year in college when I was in my dorm room. My girlfriend at the time came and she told me she was pregnant. And, at that time, this is going back 29 years. So the internet wasn't what it is today. There was no social media. There was no shout your abortion. When she came and said, "Hey, I'm pregnant," I realized that meant that there was a baby coming. I started talking through all of the things that this is going to change, right? About my life, about her life, about our life. We were freshmen in college and there's a baby coming, so things are going to change. And as I was doing that, she stopped me and she said, "Well, I'm not going to have this baby. I'm going to have an abortion." And like I said, this is when abortion happened quietly. It happened kind of in secret. It wasn't something that there were loud voices all over the place talking about. And so when she said she was going to have an abortion, I knew what it was. I didn't know anybody that had ever done that. And I really didn't know that it was something people did, right? And so all I could do was say, "No, you're not going to have an abortion." And that didn't work. No matter how many times I said it, it was made clear that it didn't matter what I said or what I thought or what I felt. She was going to have this abortion. And so that affected me. It affected her. She started struggling in school. I started struggling in school. She went and met with the counselors who agreed to waive her classes because of the abortion. And she came and told me that. I went and met with the exact same counselor the very next day. I told her the exact same story. This is the person you talked to yesterday. This is what she told you. This is the situation. This is the resolution you came to. I'm also struggling in my classes. I'm the other part of that. And the counselor just said, "No, this doesn't affect you because you're a man." It was almost like incredulous, right? Like that I would even be there presenting this to her. And so that's what I was left with from someone who, as a 19-year-old boy, was in a position of authority telling me that this doesn't affect me. And it did affect me. And I went home. I went back to the dorm and I sat there for the rest of the semester. I failed out of college. I moved home. I failed out of another college 2 more times. And then I just began, this life of destructive behavior using drugs, women, alcohol, really anything I could get my hands on to change the way that I felt. And 8 years after the abortion, I was lying on a hotel room floor overdosing at the end of a 7-year methamphetamine addiction, homeless, unemployed, and waiting for the police to come and arrest me. And so, in that moment, with nothing left, there was no one to call, no one who would have answered if I did call. But, I just turned one more time to God and, prayed that God would help me out of this because honestly, I didn't want to be found dead of an overdose in a hotel room, which would just be incredibly embarrassing to my parents and my siblings. So out of fear of embarrassing my family, I prayed that God would help me out of that situation, and he did. And so I woke up the next day, I found a pamphlet for a treatment center that I'd had for several years just shoved in my truck, and I drove that truck that hadn't had an oil change or maintenance in 5 years through a national forest to where the treatment center was, just praying that I would make it to the treatment center. And I pulled in the parking lot of the treatment center and my truck broke down. And so after I pushed my truck into a spot, I really recognized that, hey, I'm safe. Like, this is where God wants me to be. Everything's okay. And during that entire 8-year period, because I was told this doesn't affect you, And that's what I was left with. And so I never made the connection between what it was that I was feeling and, that I was trying to cover up with all of the destructive behavior and the drugs and why. And so in treatment, as we walked through my life, is when the counselor helped me to connect those dots and stopped me as I was telling my story and said, "Hey, we need to talk about this." And started giving me permission to feel and to mourn and to grieve the loss of my child and basically said, "Clearly this affected you. It doesn't matter what." It's like if someone had their arm cut off and I went and said, "This doesn't affect you." Like, clearly it affected me, right? Looking at it objectively, my life was on an upward trajectory. And then all of a sudden after the abortion, it just crashed for years and nothing else happened. And so her giving me that chance to connect those dots and to feel that and to begin to heal, and to name my child, I named my son Michael, really just helped me to move in the direction of moving through that. And so from there, I left and went back to college. I went to law school. I got married and never talked about the abortion again because she didn't tell me that I wasn't the only man. And like I said, there was no social media at this time. And so it wasn't like there was anywhere that I could see any men talking about how they had been impacted by abortions. So I just kept it in, like, almost a second layer of guilt and shame for having felt that way when nobody else felt that way. And I just kept it inside until another 8 years later. I was on a retreat and all these men were sharing all these stories, about their lives that were just incredibly vulnerable. And they were all being met not with judgment, but with grace. And so in that moment, God put it on my heart that I could share anything I wanted and I would be treated the same. And I shared the story of the abortion and all the drugs and all the things that come along with being a meth addict. And I was met with grace. More than it being healing to me was that after that, I had 3 different men come up to me privately and say, "I've never told anyone this, but, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, I lost a child to abortion." And sometimes it's men who share this who fought against it like I did, but sometimes it's men who pushed for or even forced the abortion. And, at some point, that recognition that I have failed to protect my child from death, right, hits and brings around grief and shame and regret and guilt. And in silence, men deal with this because they think they're the only one. And so by me sharing my story, I opened up the door for these other men to recognize that they are not alone. And that's when God put it on my heart that, hey, this is what it's about. So I started sharing my story a little bit more, just when asked. And at some point I was connected with Men for Life, which has been around since 2018. And we did a project together for them. And then I just kept going, with work. I had 2 kids. We adopted 3 more. And then several years ago, I just kind of looked at my life and recognized that as good as I was at practicing law, I was really bad at practicing law and being a present husband and a present father. And so I stepped away from law. And I made a post about that when I shut my office down. And shortly after that, Men for Life started asking me if I would come and run the organization. And I said emphatically no. Like, there is no way. No way you are ever going to get me to run a nonprofit. And it was about 18 months of me saying no before they stopped asking. And, I'm working on all these other things that I'm going to do. I'm going to start a business that's going to give me the freedom to be home with my family, but still make the money that I need to provide for my family. And I have these business plans ready, and I'm meeting with a consultant. And I'm on my way to California to meet with him for this business that's going to roll out the next week. And on that airplane, God very clearly convicted me and said, "You're going to go run this nonprofit." And so, I walked into that meeting and I had this giant stack of papers and I said, "Okay, I'm ready. But listen to what just happened." And what I wanted was for him to say, "This is a horrible idea," so that I could turn around and blame him for not listening to God. And instead he said, "This is an amazing idea and I will help you to grow this organization, for the money you've already paid me." So I got back on a plane and I emailed him from the plane and I said, "Hey, if you guys are still looking, I'll take the job." And so that was August of 2024. And so so it's been about, I don't know what that is, about 20 months maybe.
Even through your addiction, there's deep principles weaved into your story. How she comes to you about the abortion, you emphatically say no. Then you find yourself at the bottom of a hotel room floor, and your thought is, how is this going to affect my family? So there's a legacy component already being woven in there. And then you get yourself to the treatment center, which we know that very often after a first initial emphatic yes, there's a lag, there's a reality that sets in that sends many people running from the plan to get help. And you went to a
So,
12-step treatment center?
yes,
Okay. And do you still practice the 12 steps?
in
In
principle.
principle. In
Yeah.
principle. Right, right, right. So, because
I mean,
from
and I want to clarify that because I think that's an important question. So, what we're doing right now is something that I do, at least once, if not more times a week. And not just sharing my story is what I'm talking about.
Right,
Keeping it at the forefront in a way that opens up conversations that can help other people. That's step 12, right?
right.
So, and then of course I don't do drugs. So that's a
So
big
there's
part of
that.
it. And, step one is understanding that I'm completely powerless, and relying on God's. So everything in between, there's a lot of things that I don't recycle all the time. But yes, in the sense that I believe that by me sharing my story and opening up the door for other people to see the potential for hope and recovery, that I'm carrying that out.
Especially the maintenance component, carrying
Correct.
the message of recovering from an old self and old afflictions, and what you can do about it now. What happened, what it was like, what it's like now, what you're doing now. All of this is very oriented towards an entirely new way of living. It seems, though, that those principles were always present in you. We had talked before we started shooting. I was very excited to see that on the back of your wall are two of my favorite quotes of all time. It just happens to be my top favorite too as well, which is the poem If by Rudyard Kipling,
Yep.
which is an incredible poem about raising sons and what it means to be a man and what it means to be a person of good moral character. And then the man in the arena, right? So, what it
Yeah.
actually feels like to be a contender, not a scoffer, not a bystander. It's a very important distinction, especially for a man to conceptualize as he grows into himself. So, as these principles are, it's seemingly ever present, but they're bogged down by defeating behaviors. It seems like the belief system was always there. Did you grow up in a convicted household? Was it religious? How was your family set up growing up?
Yes, my parents have always been very faithful. My dad, some point, so my grandfather, going back to his dad, went away from the church when he was young. But the reason he went away from the church is because he didn't make much money. He had a very blue collar job, and every dollar he made, he spent sending his kids to Catholic school. And for some reason, the church thought it was a good idea during a capital campaign to publish the names of everyone and how much they donated to the church. And
Goodness.
so, he took offense to that. And I mean, his best friend for his entire life, all the way through, the day that he died, was a priest. But he walked away from the church. And at some point he moved away from the city and got a farm. And my dad worked so that he could continue to pay for his own Catholic education, in big part in hopes that he could get a scholarship after high school, which he did. But my mom went to an all-girls Catholic school, and that's how they met when she was 14 and he was 16. And so that's always been a very important part of their lives, and it was always a very important part, of our life growing up was faith, that reliance on God through everything.
You certainly want to pass that down to your children, but I've heard addiction described as internalized hopelessness. You agree with that,
Percent. I mean, every day sucked,
right?
like there was nothing, and I mean, I can remember the very first time, right? And I can remember every single thing that happened that night, the entire conversation, like what precipitated me trying, it was cocaine for the first time, everything we did that entire night. And it was just a very, very positive feeling inside. And then that's it.
Hmm.
Like never replicated that again. And then when it got to the point where it was literally making me sick,
Hmm.
and I knew that, like that was the internal struggle that I was having, was if I do more of this, I will be physically ill, and not being able to use that to stop. That's a feeling of hopelessness. That's a feeling of powerlessness. And that leads to an even greater sense of hopelessness. Because if you can't even control that, then you literally have no control over anything in your life. And that's where I was. I had no control over anything in my life. It's not like, and sometimes I have to remind people of this, because it's easy to look at me today and say, well, you don't look like an addict and you're an attorney and you have a great family. And so it can't have been that bad. But, it was the picture that people see in movies of the meth addict, right? It was the guy standing outside of the gas station asking for money. I never got to the point where I didn't have a job, so I never got to that point. Although I stole and borrowed a lot of money from a lot of people, there wasn't, but like the ticks and the behaviors and and the the lack of eye contact, and the inability sometimes to have a coherent conversation. It was all very real for a very long time, and that's part of what pushed every single person in my life away, all the way till 6 weeks before that hotel room, because I had stolen again from my family, to my dad saying, "Hey, here's a bag of your stuff. You're not allowed to come back here." And we didn't talk again from that day until right before I drove to the treatment center.
The addiction characterized by a lack of deterrence. You can't physically deter what makes the spirit sick. You could imagine being told you not only don't have a say over your child's life, but you also don't have any grounds to process, to feel, to grieve, and to cope with what just happened to you.
Right,
And being told that what you're experiencing is not real, you have no right to it. And by the way, that incredulousness you discussed, there's a whole political ideology associated with this incredulousness against men now for their participatory efforts in fatherhood when that might not be what the woman wants.
right.
Why would you say men largely stay silent on the topic of abortion? How are they trained? Is this a political training, a social training? Is it fear? What are we looking at when we see that evasiveness in men when it comes to the subject of abortion?
Yeah, I think it's all three of those things. I think that the political training, in the sense that the politics have created the social training, right? Because now it's been generations of men who have been told that they don't have the ability to speak about this. We've gone from, it's actually much less frequent that I get, you don't have a uterus, so you don't have an opinion, because I think they got tired of hearing I don't have to have a uterus to be a woman based
Mm,
on what you think. But now I'm being told I have an opinion, but it doesn't matter. So,
right.
which is fine. The reality, though, is that it's all a lie. It's all a lie created to divide men and women,
Hmm.
and destroy the family. And so, if the abortion industry didn't know how powerful men's voices could be, then they would have no need to silence them. It doesn't make sense. There's a lot of kids who say really crazy stuff, and we just kind of laugh it off. Like, we don't go around saying, you can't say that because you're a child,
Hmm.
because we just don't care. Like, kids just say silly things. And so, if it didn't matter, then they wouldn't be so hell bent on silencing men. And I think that's something that men really need to recognize. Like, nobody's trying to silence people whose opinions don't matter.
Right.
It's because of the power of men's voices that it's so important that they silence them.
Mhm.
People leaving the abortion industry and telling the truth about the abortion industry. Like, the abortion industry has to silence them. They has to say that, "Oh, those are lies," because those voices have the power to shut things down. The women who were raped and had babies, the women who were and men who are conceived in rape, like, they have to be silenced, because it changes the narrative when what they're saying brings truth to the other side. And so all of that has fought against men, from childhood at this point, to make them believe that this is a women's issue, and it's not a women's issue. Abortion is the intentional killing of an innocent human being, and that's what abortion is. And so it's a human issue.
Policy will change that legal ecology is going to change the social framing and how people think they can function in society. Law changes behavior. When we know law changes behavior when it accomplishes four things, I should say. And those four things, it would name the protected class, it would create enforceable duties, it changes institutional incentives, and then it teaches the public what conduct is no longer socially tolerable. We saw that with Roe legislation. And there was an influx of policies that negated the father's role, the necessity for a father, and we've statistically seen catastrophic climbing in fatherless homes because men are told they're not needed.
Right.
That's the great debate now is how do we draft policy that is life affirming is there a legal bridge that really exists for men to participate in the decision to abort their child. And that can go both ways, right? So that's a bit tricky and I'm sure you've
That's
seen
exactly what I was gonna say. Yeah.
right.
And that's been question that's a question that I've been asked before. Is it worth creating legislation that gives dad a say? Well, there's a lot of bad men.
Right.
I'm not naive to the fact that some abortions are because of a lack of willingness to take responsibility by men. I think that the only reason a man would be pro-choice is so that he can use women as objects for his own personal pleasure without fear of responsibility or consequence. And those men exist, right? And so if you create a law that gives the man equal say, in an abortion, with the decisions still being what they are today, have an abortion or don't, then you take a big chance of bad men uh, being able to accomplish the same thing that bad women are able to accomplish today. So I don't think that's the solution. I think there are other solutions, but you just said it. You have to protect the class, and that's the only solution.
Where you ultimately land is the class must be protected,
Right,
regardless of what either parent has to say over that class. And, ideally, our Constitution would be interpreted as protecting humanness, whatever someone's opinion might be on personhood. There are, as you've seen in your work, competing opinions
right.
about personhood or undue burdens on one
Yeah.
parent or the other or both.
But personhood is a legal term. So
Yeah,
you talk about
explain
the
that.
laws, and I think that personhood is not a biological term, right? A human being is a biological term, but personhood is a legal term. I think that it's the idea that not all humans are persons, and people are going to think that I'm supposed to say people, but I can guarantee you that if Google it, it's persons. That not all human beings are persons under those laws that has led to where we are today, and so that's not really. People can have an opinion on that, whether or not that law would be correct. I currently have an opinion that laws which do not give personhood to the unborn are incorrect. So we can have opinions on that, but that would be the fight for the law is to give the unborn personhood, and then it's a legal thing. And so then that shapes, as you said earlier, that shapes society,
To view personhood as a legal term that we have to define correctly, and we
right?
haven't been able to. I wanna get into how you use the phrase "failed masculinity" in your
Yeah.
work.
I am very clear that I believe that abortion, as it stands today, is the product of failed masculinity. It's the passivity, it's the silence of good men. There's also the absence of masculinity in bad men, but the failure of masculinity in good men to speak boldly and to fight for what's right, regardless of what the opposition says, and in the face of the most violent opposition. And where we are today, it's like literally violent, right? Not just like strong opposition. There's violence involved. That is part of being a man, is to fight for what's right because it's right, not because um, it feels good to impress somebody else, right? It's because it's right. And we've got, failed masculinity is something that's been occurring for a very long time. You talk about The Man in the Arena by Teddy Roosevelt. And that's what that entire speech is about. That entire speech is about, how nothing comes for the man on the sidelines. Nothing comes for the armchair quarterback. There's nothing glorious or fulfilling, is probably a better word, about being a man who criticizes how other people do things, whether they do it right or wrong. Everything comes from being in the fight, from having your face marred by blood and sweat and tears, whether you win or lose. But if you lose, to get up and fight again. That's where fulfillment as a man comes from. What we have today is, in large part, it's because we've got generations of men who have been told this isn't your fight by the opposition, stay out of it, and strongly, like with hate, right? It's demonic. So those voices against men are hateful and demonic voices. And then the other side, the pro-life side, for 53 years, so hyper focused on mom and baby, as they should have been, that there were no voices calling the men to action. And so they just sat there. Even men who were pro-life. And you look today, there's a Gallup poll from June of last year that found that 54% of men in America identify as pro-life. But where are they?
Right.
Right? What are they doing? It's easy to be passively pro-life, right? It's easy to show up to the marches. It's easy to show up to the banquets and to, to be in a room full of pro-life people and say, yes, I'm pro-life too, because it's safe and
Mhm.
it's comfortable. We're not called to comfort. We're commanded to be courageous. We're commanded to speak boldly for what's right. And that's what it means to restore that masculinity, is to step into the arena and to be part of the fight and to protect and to provide and to lead and to serve and to do it all in a way that leaves a legacy that honors God.
We have a generation of men who, and I don't like to rag on the younger generations as habit, but I think we can fairly say that
Yeah,
our younger generations, mine included, they're much more focused on consumption than formation. And so you'll never get into the arena at great personal cost
right.
if there is not a strong sense of duty in your life.
Yes, but that is a failure of masculinity as well, because
Right.
that falls on my generation, right? That falls on the generations before me. They didn't call those men to action. And look, and I say my generation because I'm 48. My kids are way younger than most people who are my age,
Mhm.
but so I'm still forming them. But it's
Mhm.
that formation you talked about. Like you don't get formation on your own, right? It comes from people that came before you. And so that consumption and that failure of masculinity, that passivity, leading the next generation of men, that fatherlessness that you talked about is a huge contributor. Where are they going to get it from if there's nobody there to give it to them? All of that combined, and so I don't think you're ragging on the next generation of men, or I think that it's there's a point where we have to say, hey, I recognize that you didn't have an opportunity to be formed in this way. And once we recognize that as the problem, there is an obligation on the part of the older generations of men to raise them up,
Right.
to give them that. And they want it. Like they want it. And here's how I know they want it. Because when there were no voices speaking to masculinity, and the first voices came in, right? And it was Andrew Tate and those guys came in. They shot up in
Yep.
popularity
Yep.
because there was a hunger for something different that people weren't being given. And they shot up. Unfortunately, those first voices were toxic, and they were hedonistic. They were self-serving masculinity instead of true masculinity, which is in service of others. And so those voices were there, and the fact that they gained so much popularity shows that there was a hunger for something different. And so now it's just up to good men to counter those voices, but still feel that hunger. In other things that show that that's true, you can look at NBC poll from the end of last year that showed that it listed 13 categories that the people could choose from as the number one indicator of success. Ranked them as indicators of success. And when you separate men and women, 18 to 29, both liberal and conservative men chose children as a much higher indicator of success than the women in those same demographics did. The conservative men, 18 to 29, chose children as number one indicator of success. Okay. Conservative women chose it at 6. Liberal men chose it at 10, or liberal women chose it at 12, right above social media influencer. So people can say, well, yeah, but most men are liberal, which is not true,
Mhm.
because now what we have is from um, from 2020 to 2024, there's a 7 point shift, which a 7 point shift means there's a 14 point spread from the left to the right in that same demographic of 18 to 29-year-old men. They are moving away from the lies and towards the truth. And then we have 2 weeks ago a poll that showed that young men in that same demographic, 42% of them say that their faith in God and their religion is an important factor in their life, which is 13 points higher than the year before. And so, again, they're moving away from the lies and towards the truth. So they are hungry for something new. They recognize that it's not coming from the loud voices on the other side, and they're just moving to this
Right.
side. And what that does is that opens up a very interesting window of time where we not only have the ability as good men to form these men, and to form them in biblical ways, and to help them to find truth so that they can lead and they can serve and they can protect and they can provide, because as they lead, others will follow. But it's an obligation on us, because if we miss this chance, then somebody else will take it. And so I think that it's really important that good men get off the couch, get off the sidelines, get into the arena, and speak boldly for life, for family, and for faith, and lead the next generation. And not just lead in a very visible way, but also in a hands-on way.
The first wave of these types of men, Tate brothers and even Fuentes, they feasted like pirates on the spoils of their plunder. And that is very flashy. They were graced with a lot of algorithmic visibility and a strong following
Yeah.
initially. We are deep enough into their run for the exposure, for the cracks to start to form. The cuts are starting to bleed. We're starting to see the legal ramifications. We're starting to see the social ramifications. Their same spiel does that. It just results in spoils that do spoil. It rots the body, it rots the mind and the spirit. And I think what men really need is to go on a hero's journey, but it's kind of like Dante in the Divine Comedy. You find as was it Nietzsche who was accredited with saying that if you stare into the darkness long enough, light, and if you do it well, it's very difficult to do it, light will stare back. Something I know Jordan Peterson had brought that up
Yeah.
last couple of
And it's
years.
probably Nietzsche because he
Yeah,
he he likes
probably
to quote him.
knowing that it was, yeah. And so that always reminded me of the Divine Comedy. And so where Dante descends into the circles of hell with a guide. You have to have a Virgil. You have to have a
Yeah.
worthy guide. You do not want to go into that alone. Do not overestimate the self. It's very easy to get lost and to wallow in the pits of hell forever. But at the end of the hero's journey, Dante kneels before duty and before a power greater than himself. And so that is the thing that will bring you into the arena every day, over and over and over again. And that will be worth the cost of the self, the dying to the self that is required for a hero to emerge. It's just part of that archetype of the hero's journey. But
But it's so
humans are
fulfilling.
driven by, yeah, yeah,
I mean, and it sucks that the term is dying of self because it makes it sound so onerous, and it is. It's onerous, right? But it's so fulfilling when you see the fruits of that labor, when you see what comes out on the other side. It's so fulfilling when you do something selfless and see how that raises up another person. And that is a greater reward than anything we can get when we're serving ourselves.
It's not unlike recovery language, where it's not about what you can't do anymore. It's about being rocketed into that fourth dimension. It's about reaching a place in life that what you receive is the ability to do everything that you couldn't do before, subjected to your own chains. That return, though, you can't sell that very easy, like the Tate brothers can sell their bullcrap.
It's way easier to say, hey, go make a bunch of money and buy a Bugatti and you'll get the girl you want. I mean,
Right.
like, first of all, you're not going to make that much money. Like, the average person's not going to make enough money to buy a Bugatti. I have researched Bugattis heavily. And I know that is not something that I will be buying.
Sure.
But the truth is, you make a bunch of money, you buy a Bugatti, you get the woman who wants that. You
Mhm.
lose that, she's gone, which means it wasn't real. And so what's real is building yourself into a man worthy of the woman who was created for you. And it's a different way to look at things because the reality is it's not until you are willing to do for others. I think that, I hear what you're saying. And, in the fatherhood program that Men for Life is creating for pregnancy centers, the entire basis of the first initial meeting is pouring into the man in a way that no man probably has, but letting him know you can be more than you've ever been told you can be, and you can live for something greater than yourself. And we here at this pregnancy center can teach you how to do that. Like, I think that men want that. And even if they want it without knowing it's what they want, because they know they don't want what they currently have because it's not real, like, I think that is an important thing. I think that it's innate inside men to do that. And I think that that's the reason that there are so many men who aren't doing that, is the reason that there are so many unhappy men.
Ideally, in a marriage, then you give your wife the ability to bless you. There
Yeah.
is
Yes.
a great amount of pleasure that's derived from viewing headship as servitude.
Yeah, and I think that, you raise another point, is that these guys like Andrew Tate, they've what they've created is a system of competition between men and women, right?
Mhm.
And men and women weren't made to compete. We're not enemies.
Right.
Men and women are not enemies. Men and women were made to complement each other. And so you can't compliment someone who you view as an enemy. And you can't be happy with someone who you view as an enemy. It just doesn't make sense. The idea that you can view women as your competition or as an enemy, but that you're still pursuing them then when you get them, you view them as an enemy, you will never be happy. You've gotten something that you believe is opposed to you. It's completely nonsensical the way that it's gone about. It's flashy. You know, Andrew Tate was an MMA fighter. You know, he's strong. He's a protector. He's rich, although he got his money from pornography and manipulating and men and women. Like it's not a great way to go, and not somebody that people should look up to. But I think that he's got a lot of money and he's in good shape, and you know, and so it's appealing to those young men. But there are a lot of men in our country, especially, who are good masculine men who can set that example and who just don't know how important it is that they be out front. And I will tell you, when I go to speak at events, the number of men who come up afterwards or go directly to the pregnancy center director afterwards and say, "Thank you for calling men to action." They've just been waiting for somebody to call them into the arena, right?
Right.
They've just been waiting and nobody's been doing it, you know? And so, you know, I'm very, very clear on the fact that nothing about me is special, except that God has given me the ability to share his message in a way that men need to hear it so that they can step up and lead their families.
I want to challenge one term, which is enemy, because I think in our contextual understanding in the English, enemy is synonymous with adversary. But there is one Hebrew term that I've learned,
Yeah.
which is ezer kenegdo, which is translated either as suitable helper or sometimes as perfect enemy, according to the scholar Dr. Skip Moen.
Okay.
But it is meant. It's a very specific. It's a the
That would be
response.
how Eve was described in the Bible, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and
I
it's
had
there's
never
a
heard the second definition of the
so
second
it's a
translation.
high responsibility placed on that role. It is not something to be taken lightly, and here are the distinctions. So when I act as my husband's perfect enemy, my duty is to God. It is not to my own agenda. Very often I want to advise my husband on my own agenda because I want to get what I want, right? But I my obligation is not to do that. That is actually not my responsibility in the home. So my responsibility in the home is to be a relational connection between him and God, not standing as a sort of obstacle or gateway for him, but to be an enhancement of his relational abilities with God. And so to do that, it is my duty to know what I can of my God and to bless my husband when he's on the path of righteousness and vehemently oppose him when he's off of it.
Yeah, to
None of
challenge
that
them.
occurs. Right, to challenge, right, to
Yeah,
contend, to challenge. And so we laugh sometimes about the term perfect enemy of,
yeah,
"I couldn't get through this without you," but it's certainly hard to live with you through this, right? And it's funny, and we
right.
joke about it, right? And it's good-natured, but I will say that adversarial context that you're referring to,
Yeah,
absolutely true, incompatible in human relationships. We are not to be competing with each other, but there are some religions, some even fast growing in the US that do pit men and women adversarially to each other. And I think that's where a lot of those young men, if they are not receiving the type of message, say that you're carrying from not only your years of experience, but your testimony before God to say, you don't need to have those types of dynamics between men and women. Here's actually what you can be as a man. And you have so much potential that adversity kind of falls away because it's actually alarmingly prevalent in some of the Islamism and some of the things that we're seeing in this country that are actually promoted by the personalities of people like the Tate brothers. And it's
right.
highly concerning. We have to get away from that.
I agree. I
Yeah.
think that, you know, there is nothing, you know, to your first point, I think there is I am very clear, and I tell Michelle, my wife, all the time. I would be so unhappy if I had a wife who didn't challenge me when I needed to be challenged. And
Mm.
sometimes she challenges me when I don't need to be challenged. But maybe that's really me challenging her when she needs to be challenged.
Sure.
But I would be so unhappy. That just sounds miserable, you know, like, because I'm not right all the time. And look, I grew up in a family where everyone is right all the time. Like, even if we disagreed with each other, like, everyone is right all the time, and getting a legal training didn't help that.
No, I'm
But,
sure.
but I'm keenly aware internally that I am not right all the time, and so sometimes I need to be challenged. You know, and on the other side of that, like, I wouldn't work as hard as I work if
Right.
not for knowing that, that I am here to help her. Look, I could be happy on my own. If I were on my own, I could be happy, in a one bedroom cabin in
Mhm.
the woods.
Right.
There's not much I would need, but so it wouldn't take a lot of work to get it. But to have this amazing woman who I want to serve,
Yeah.
and who I want to challenge me to be better. It does. It helps me to be better. So I love that term perfect enemy. I hadn't heard that before. I think I'll use it tonight without any context and see how that goes.
You see how far it gets you?
That's right.
Unfortunately, we need to come in for a landing. I feel like we could
Yeah.
talk for a lot longer on all of these topics. But tell us a bit more about the services that you offer at your organization.
As I mentioned, we're currently in development of a fatherhood program for pregnancy centers. The pilot of that rolls out on July 1st. And then as I've gone and spoken on this in so many different places, like I just got back from New Jersey, and tomorrow I leave for Maine, and then next week I'm in Pennsylvania. And so I get this opportunity to speak is I have so many men come up afterwards and say, "Thank you. What can I do?"
Mhm.
And so I recognized that I was calling men to action without giving them something to do, right? Which is not a way to get anything done. It's a way to make men feel like you're not doing enough and you should be doing more. Now go figure it out. And so we are also building, and it's starting with an online mentorship or membership platform, the Men for Life Arena, based on the Teddy Roosevelt speech, and to help form men into so that they can go out and form others, right? And we will have pro life apologetics. The mission, the vision of Men for Life is a world where abortion is unthinkable because men have stepped back into the arena. So abortion and pro life apologetics will be really important, but it's important to connect that obligation to be pro life to the call to biblical masculinity. And so we will also have speakers on mentors on masculinity, mentors on faith and finance and family and parenting and marriage, all of the things that it takes, as much as on how do we go out and fight to protect the unborn, which is the ultimate goal of Men for Life. So that also will be opening up on July 1st. And, on the heels of that, on September 12th in Nashville, we are going to have our first pro life men's conference. Based on initial reactions and responses, we're anticipating having as many as 500 men. I'm working with Tennessee Right to Life to put that together. I've got great speakers lined up. Nick Freitas is closing out the day. And, the whole idea of that, again, is to call men to action,
Right.
to call them to do something, to connect that call to biblical masculinity to the obligation to protect life and to protect life boldly, because it's not enough to write checks. It's not, and look, I run a nonprofit and I typically speak in the capacity of raising funds for nonprofits. Checks are very important, but we're called to give our time, our talents, and our treasures, and unfortunately we're in a society today where men have consigned themselves to write checks, and if we can acknowledge that we're in a spiritual war and that 90% of the people fighting in this war are women, then if we as men have consigned ourselves to sit back and write checks to fund a war that we send our women off to fight, then that's another failure of masculinity. And the great thing about this is, you can look at Promise Keepers study from 2020 that showed that when men, fathers, lead their family to church, there's a 93% chance that those children will continue to church. When it's mothers alone without the father, it drops to 14%. That statistic is not in a vacuum, right? Because we could contrast that with all the fatherlessness statistics that show all these high numbers of horrible things that happen in fatherless homes, right?
Yep.
So the leadership of good men will raise up good men. And as men lead, everyone else follows. People can say that that's not true, but the reality is you don't know that it's not true because all we have is statistics showing that it is true. And and unfortunately, we have men who have not been leading. And so we've got this weird situation where first wave feminists came in and said, "Hey, men need to sit out." Actually, the first wave feminists came in and all they wanted was for men to be back in the home after the Industrial Revolution.
Mhm.
And when that didn't work, you got second wave feminists coming in and saying men need to sit this out, men are bad. Then what we have today is an entire generation of women who have been told that men are bad, and an entire generation of men or generations of men who've been told that they are bad. And so they're not doing anything masculine, which leads to this generation of women today wondering where all the men are.
Mhm.
And so now this generation sees men as bad because of the absence of masculinity. And so it's a really crazy situation that has occurred. But as men lead, the next generation will follow. And yesterday was Mother's Day, and I posted something that showed that, and I say this all the time because I practiced divorce law and child custody law for 10 years. And the thing that I recognized always is that how you treat the mother of your children, whether you're married or not, how you treat the mother of your children is showing young girls how men should treat them. And it's showing young boys how they should treat women. And so it is so important that we as men lead because everyone else will follow.
Sean, thank you so much for your time. Tell everybody where they can find your website. I so appreciate you talking with me today and
Thank you, Jillian.
for everything you're doing. On Rebranding Motherhood, we talk about the lie that motherhood is a trap and that if you are in a situation where you need support, then no one will be there to help you or to be a steady voice for you. I want to talk to you about our Project Loveline that decimates that lie and helps women get real help in real time. We connect women with resources, or if we can't find one, we become the resource. So if you, someone you know, needs to access our hotline, you can visit us at loveline.com. And if you want to volunteer, if you want to be that steady voice in someone's life, we would love to talk to you about your heart for helping mothers. Thank you.